Most people will go their entire life without realizing why they feel different. They'll be told they're antisocial, cold, hard to read, maybe even broken, and they'll believe it, because nobody ever explained what they actually are. So answer one question honestly. Would you rather spend Friday night completely alone than at a party full of people who like you? If the answer is yes, you need to hear this. What you're about to see isn't a list of flaws. It's 7 traits Friedrich Nietzsche identified in people built for solitude. Traits the world keeps mislabeling as something broken. Most people won't recognize all 7 in themselves. If you recognize even 3, you've found something about yourself the rest of the world has been getting wrong for years. Here's the first thing to understand before we start counting: why everyone mislabels solitude. Society decided a long time ago that wanting people around you constantly is healthy, and wanting to be alone is a problem to fix. Nobody studies you closely enough to get the real diagnosis. They reach for the nearest familiar label: shy, cold, difficult, and move on. And you're left carrying a description of yourself that was never accurate. You've felt this whiplash yourself. Turning down a Saturday invitation to stay home with a book and a candle, then feeling a flash of guilt, like solitude were a quiet failure instead of a preference. Nietzsche would have found this absurd. Solitude isn't the absence of a life for a specific kind of person. It's the precondition for one. Every trait that follows has been misdiagnosed by someone who loves you. Let's name them properly, starting with the one almost everyone gets wrong first. Quick context on the man doing the diagnosing. By 24, before he'd even finished his doctorate, Nietzsche was the youngest professor in the history of his university, a prodigy who could have spent his life surrounded by colleagues. Instead, he spent most of it walking alone, for hours, saying his best thoughts never once arrived at a desk surrounded by other people. He called himself, late in life, a free spirit, free not from responsibility, but from needing to think the way the room around him was thinking. Keep that in mind. Every trait below is something he lived before he ever bothered to write it down. Trait 1, being around people. Even people you genuinely like costs you something, and being alone gives it back. People call this low social stamina, or worse, not really liking the people you just spent the evening with. Reality is an energy architecture, not a social skill. It's bandwidth, not confidence. Conversation, eye contact, the constant low-level effort of reading a room. For some people, that drains a battery that only refills in silence. You can love your friends completely and still need to leave the dinner 30 minutes early, not because you're bored, but because your system has simply run its course for the night. Think about the last work trip or family gathering that left you wiped out for 2 full days while everyone else bounced back by Monday morning. The old story says something's wrong with you. The real story is that you and the people around you are running fundamentally different operating systems, and judging your battery life by their charging speed was never going to add up. Nietzsche lived this almost literally. He needed long stretches of total isolation just to function, not an indulgence maintenance. He treated solitude the way an athlete treats sleep, not optional, a biological requirement for what he was capable of producing. Ask yourself honestly, after a full day of people, is solitude where you go to recover or where you go to escape? If it's recovery, you already have trait 1. But recovering from people isn't actually the biggest difference between you and everyone else. The next trait is the one almost nobody can fake. Trait 2. You'd rather sit in total silence with someone than fill the air with small talk. Most people clock this as awkwardness. It's the opposite. The one trait almost nobody names correctly while you're young, and almost everyone recognizes too late, once they've watched enough bad conversation to know what real ease looks like. Watch a room full of people who fear solitude. The moment a pause lasts more than 4 seconds, somebody rushes to fill it. Whether a joke, anything. Silence feels to them like a wound that needs stitching shut immediately. To you, it's just a room you're comfortable standing in. You've noticed it on dates, in interviews, at family dinners. The specific discomfort other people feel the second a conversation lulls, and the specific calm you feel in that exact same moment. They reach for their phone. You don't reach for anything. This wasn't decoration in Nietzsche's worldview. He had deep contempt for idle chatter, conversation performed purely to avoid the discomfort of a quiet moment. He believed real thought required exactly the kind of stillness that nervous, herd-dependent people instinctively destroy the second it appears. If you've ever sat across from someone you genuinely like and felt no urgency to keep the conversation moving, that wasn't disinterest. That was a comfort most people spend their whole lives trying to fake. Most people can fake trait 1 for an evening. Almost nobody can fake trait 2 for longer than that, and trait 3 is where the fakers disappear completely. Trait 3. Your best thinking happens when no one else is in the room. People read this as not being a team player. Workplaces are structurally built to miss it entirely. Every process rewards the person who looks productive in the meeting, not the person whose actual contribution arrives 3 hours later, alone, in the car. Group brainstorms, the popular myth that ideas get better the more people pile onto them. None of that matches your actual experience. Your sharpest insight tends to arrive in the shower, on a walk, lying awake at 1, and far from a whiteboard and a room full of competing voices. This is almost exactly the mechanism Nietzsche described in his own creative life. He treated long solitary walking as a thinking apparatus, not a break from the work. The actual machine the work got produced on. Group settings, by contrast, tend to average ideas toward whatever the loudest person in the room believes. If you've ever sat through an entire brainstorm contributing almost nothing, only to have the actual answer arrive on the drive home. Alone, in silence. That's not a failure to perform under pressure. That's proof of where your particular machine runs. So far, we've only talked about what happens around other people. The next 3 traits are different. Up until now, we've talked about what happens around other people. From here, we're talking about what solitude actually builds inside you. Not how you recharge, but who you are underneath the recharging. Trait 4. You make real decisions alone, and you don't feel the itch to run them past a committee first. Family and friends call this stubbornness. It's actually the trait punished most, not just ignored, because it doesn't ask anyone for permission, including the people who'd like to feel consulted. Most people, faced with anything that matters, a job offer, a breakup, instinctively widen the circle, want 5 opinions before they trust their own. You narrow the circle instead. Get quiet. Decide. This doesn't mean you never ask for input. It means you ask for information, not permission. There's a real difference between wanting someone's perspective on a detail you hadn't considered and not trusting your own conclusion until someone else blesses it. Nietzsche's entire philosophy rests on a single claim. There's no external authority handing down the rules for how to live. No committee in the sky issuing verdicts on your choices. You're the one who has to decide what your life means, whether you like it or not. Picture the last decision you made without consulting anyone. Did the doubt show up while deciding? Or only afterward when someone asked why you didn't check with them first? If it only showed up afterward, imported from someone else's expectation. The decision itself was never the problem. This is the trait that makes people most uncomfortable around you. The next one is the trait that makes them say it out loud. Trait 5. You don't feel obligated to explain your choices to everyone who has an opinion about them. People mistake this for rudeness, usually the ones who were never owed an explanation in the first place. Most people answer every question fired at them, regardless of who's asking. You've quietly drawn a line most people never draw. Not everyone who asks a question has earned an answer. This lines up almost exactly with how Nietzsche treated his harshest critics, by not treating them at all. He rarely engaged directly with attacks on his work, choosing instead to keep producing more of it. Explaining yourself to someone who was never going to update their opinion anyway isn't honesty. It's a tax you're choosing to pay. Notice the specific people this applies to. Rarely the ones closest to you, who've actually earned context. Almost always the wider circle. The acquaintance who feels entitled to know why you're single. The relative who feels entitled to know why you left a job. Next time you feel the urge to explain yourself, ask one question first. Has this person actually earned the context? Or do they just feel entitled to it? This trait gets you called cold by people who had no claim on the answer to begin with. The next one gets you called cold by people you actually love, and it's the one that hurts the most until you understand it. Trait 6. You can be misunderstood by people you care about and still sleep fine that night. People mistake this for indifference. It's the opposite. Caring enough about the truth of who you are to not need everyone's vote on it. Most people find being misread unbearable. They'll over-explain, send the follow, up text, replay the conversation for days. You've made a quieter peace with a harder truth. Most people are never going to fully see you, and chasing that is a losing game. A friend assumes the worst about why you canceled, and you don't rush to correct the record. A family member retells an old disagreement slightly wrong, and you let it sit instead of relitigating it for the 10th time. Each moment tests whether your sense of yourself depends on winning the narrative, or survives intact, even when it gets away from you. Nietzsche was badly misunderstood by nearly everyone around him while he was alive, and he kept writing anyway, for an audience that mostly didn't exist yet. Ask yourself, when someone gets you wrong, does the discomfort fade in an hour, or follow you around for days? The length of that aftertaste tells you how much of your stability is actually self-sourced. This is the one that hurts most, because it's the people who love you doing the misdiagnosing. The 7th trait is where all 6 of these actually come from. Trait 7. The one that explains all the others. The further you get from the crowd, the more like yourself you feel. Most people feel safest inside the group, more certain of who they are, the closer they stand to everyone else. For a small minority, it's the opposite. The noise of the group doesn't clarify who they are. It buries it. Only in distance does their own almost nobody names this correctly from the outside. They call it withdrawal, shutting people out. It's almost always the opposite, the only maintenance routine that actually works. This was the entire arc of Nietzsche's philosophy. Becoming who you actually are requires getting far enough from the herd to hear your own voice over everyone else's. Not permanently, not as punishment. As a return trip you take again and again, every time the noise gets loud enough to drown you out. If solitude has ever felt less like loneliness and more like coming home, you already know exactly what he meant. There's a difference between genuinely preferring solitude and using isolation to avoid people out of fear, rejection, conflict, being truly seen. Everything above describes people who choose distance from strength, who can still show up and care deeply about specific people when it matters. None of this is a competition for who can need people the least. These 7 traits aren't a hierarchy with isolation at the top, just a less common wiring that gets treated as a deficiency, mostly because it's outnumbered, not because it's wrong. If solitude has started to feel less like a choice and more like a wall you can't come down from, that's worth being honest about, and worth talking to someone you trust, or a professional, rather than assuming it's just who you are. Notice something. None of these 7 traits are actually separate. They all come from one source. Most people discover who they are by getting closer to the crowd. More friends, more validation, more rooms full of people confirming the same story back to them. You discover who you are by stepping away from it. Every trait on this list is just that one fact, wearing 7 different outfits. That's the difference. Nietzsche spent his entire life describing, mostly alone, walking through the Alps, while everyone else stayed in the village comparing notes on who belonged where. Not a flaw, not a personality quirk. A different direction entirely toward yourself, instead of toward the room. So here's what to actually do with this. This week, give yourself one full evening of total, unapologetic solitude. No guilt text explaining why you're not coming. No scrolling to fill the quiet. Just the thing your nature has been asking for, undiagnosed, for years. Notice what happens in your own head when nobody is competing for your attention. You don't need a single one of these 7 validated by anyone watching this. The whole point is that you finally have the right name for something that's been correct about you all along. There's a deeper part of this. What happens once you stop letting other people's wrong diagnosis define you, that I go further into for the people who've already shown me they're serious, behind the join button. If even 3 of these 7 described you, subscribe. You're exactly who this channel is for.